The first time my husband demanded it in the buggy, we were less than 10 minutes from church. That is the detail I remember most clearly. Not the road, not the weather, not even what he said at first. I remember knowing that in a few minutes we would be standing beside other families, shaking hands, greeting neighbors, and pretending that nothing unusual had happened. The horse was moving steadily beneath us. The wheels made that familiar wooden rhythm against the packed dirt road. The morning was cold enough that I could see my breath when I turned toward the open side of the buggy. I had dressed carefully for church. My prayer covering was pinned. My dress was pressed. My Bible was resting beside me. Everything about me looked like a respectable Amish wife on her way to worship. Inside, I was trying not to panic. My husband Daniel had been quiet most of the morning. I knew that kind of quiet. By then, I had learned that silence from him usually meant a request was coming. Except request was not really the right word. I did not have the right word then. I do now. He turned toward me and told me what he wanted. I hesitated. That hesitation was enough. His face changed. Not dramatically. He did not shout. He did not stop the buggy. He did not raise his hand. He simply looked at me and said, "You are my wife." 4 words. That was the whole argument. At 21 years old, those 4 words contained more authority than anything I could have said back. And that morning, on the way to church, I learned that even a buggy could become a place where a woman's refusal disappeared. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, what city are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And when the story is over, come back and tell us what you thought. We'd love to hear your honest review. Now, let's get back to the story. My name is Hannah. I was raised in an old order Amish community, married young, and spent years believing that being a good wife meant making my own discomfort smaller than my husband's expectations. Before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to be exact. Amish communities are not all the same. Different affiliations, districts, bishops, and families can have very different expectations. I'm not saying every Amish husband behaves this way. I'm not saying every community teaches marriage exactly as mine did. I am telling you what happened inside my marriage and how the beliefs around us shaped the way I understood it. That distinction matters. Because the most dangerous stories are not always the ones where someone announces, "You have no choice." Sometimes no one has to say it. Sometimes the entire structure around you has already answered the question. If you were raised in a family or religious community where marriage was treated as a duty before it was treated as a relationship, you may recognize some of this, and if these stories help you understand experiences that were difficult to name, subscribe and stay with me. There are things I did not understand until years after I left. This is one of them. Church Sundays were important in our community. You prepared for them. Clothes were chosen carefully. Work was arranged around the service. Children were cleaned and dressed. Families traveled together in buggies. On the road you passed neighbors going in the same direction. There was something beautiful about it. I still remember lines of dark buggies moving through early morning mist. Horses breathing clouds into the cold. Fields quiet after harvest. Children peeking through buggy openings. Those memories are real. So is what happened inside mine. That is something people sometimes struggle to understand. A place can contain beauty and harm at the same time. One does not cancel the other. Daniel and I had been married a little over 2 years when that morning happened. By then, there were certain patterns I understood without needing them explained. He believed a husband should lead. I had been taught much the same thing. The husband carried responsibility. The wife supported. The husband made final decisions. The wife was expected to cooperate. If a wife resisted too often, people did not necessarily say she had boundaries. They might say she was stubborn, difficult, prideful, unsubmissive. Those words mattered. They were not casual insults. They were moral judgments. And moral judgments are powerful when your whole world is built around belonging. I had heard older women describe marriage in ways that sounded gentle. Keep peace in your home. Do not send your husband away dissatisfied. Remember that men have needs. Do not make small things into big things. Nobody explained what should happen when the so-called small thing was your own discomfort. That part was missing. The first year of marriage, I assumed I would eventually become less afraid of disappointing Daniel. Instead, I became better at avoiding disappointment. There is a difference. I learned his moods. I knew when he wanted affection. I knew when he was frustrated. I knew when a disagreement at breakfast might follow us through the entire day. I became skilled at reading silence. Women in controlled marriages often become very good observers. Not because they are naturally anxious. Because observation becomes useful. You watch the way a cup is placed on the table. You hear how a door closes. You notice the length of a pause. You learn whether the evening is safe before the other person has said 10 words. On that church morning, I knew Daniel was irritated before we left home. I had been tired the previous night. I had said I wanted to sleep. That was all. He had not argued. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, he became distant. He ate breakfast without much conversation. He harnessed the horse. He checked the buggy. I followed him outside. The silence came with us. At first, I thought church would save me from the tension. That sounds strange now, but church meant people. People meant witnesses. Witnesses meant normal behavior. I thought once we reached the gathering, the morning would reset. Then, a few miles from the house where worship was being held, Daniel told me what he expected. I will not describe the intimate details. They are not necessary. What matters is that he wanted something involving my body. I did not, I said. Very quietly, not here. That was my refusal. Notice the wording. I did not even say no, I said not here. I was bargaining with location because I did not believe I had enough authority to question the expectation itself. Daniel's jaw tightened. He told me that being in a buggy did not change the fact that I was his wife. I looked toward the road. I remember another buggy far behind us. I could see the horse's head moving above the road dust. For 1 second, I imagined waving. Not for help exactly, just to make someone come closer. Then I felt ashamed for even thinking it. That is what training can do. You can feel unsafe and still believe asking for help would be the greater wrongdoing. I told Daniel we would be at church soon. He answered, "Then stop making this difficult." That sentence stayed with me. Stop making this difficult. He had turned my discomfort into the problem, not his demand, my reaction to it. I had experienced that pattern before, but never somewhere so physically close to other people. That was what made the buggy incident different. Families were traveling on the same road. A church gathering waited only minutes away. I was surrounded by community, and yet I felt completely alone. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being visible but unable to speak. We arrived at church. I stepped down from the buggy. An older woman smiled at me. She said, "Cold morning?" I said yes. Someone asked how my mother was. I answered. A girl I had known since childhood stood nearby holding a baby. Men gathered separately. Women moved toward the house. Nothing stopped. That is important. Nothing stopped. The world did not notice what had just happened. I remember washing my hands before the meal later that day. I held them under cold water longer than necessary. A woman beside me asked whether I was feeling well. I said I was tired. Tired became one of my favorite words. It explained red eyes, quietness, a shaking hand. Not eating much. Tired was acceptable. Afraid was complicated. After worship, one of the older women sat beside me while food was being arranged. I will call her Ruth. She was probably in her late 40s then. I thought of her as old. Now I smile at that. She was cutting bread. Without looking at me, she said, "You and Daniel seemed quiet when you arrived." I froze. I wondered if she knew. I said, "We were fine." Ruth continued cutting. Then she said, "Fine is a word women use when they do not want a question repeated." I looked at her. She still did not look at me. That was how women sometimes communicated forbidden things. Sideways, while working, without making the conversation look like a conversation, I wanted to tell her everything. Instead, I said, "What if a husband wants something his wife does not?" Her knife stopped only for a moment. Then she resumed. She asked, "Something sinful?" I said, "No." She asked, "Something that frightens her?" I said, "Maybe." Ruth set the knife down. She finally looked at me. Then she gave me one of the most complicated pieces of advice I ever received. She said, "Sometimes a woman has to know the difference between keeping peace and surrendering herself." I did not completely understand. I asked how you knew the difference. She answered, "You know it after you have crossed it too many times." Then another woman walked into the room. The conversation ended. For months that sentence followed me. Keeping peace, surrendering yourself. I had always thought they were the same thing. A good wife gave, a good wife accommodated. A good wife did not embarrass her husband by refusing him. That was how I had organized marriage in my mind. But Ruth's sentence suggested there was a boundary somewhere, a line, and perhaps I had already been crossing it. After that Sunday, I began noticing how women talked about husbands. Not openly. Never openly. You heard small things. "He has been difficult lately. She needs more rest. She is trying to keep things peaceful. He expects a lot." Those phrases could hold entire marriages inside them. Nobody used words like coercion. Nobody said bodily autonomy. Nobody asked whether a wife felt free to say no. We had spiritual vocabulary. We had practical vocabulary. We did not have much vocabulary for power. That absence was not small. If there is no word for something, it becomes harder to point at. If you cannot point at it, people can tell you it is nothing. Daniel did not mention the Buggy incident afterward. That confused me. For him, I think it was over. For me, it became a marker. Before that morning, I still believed that certain places protected me. The kitchen if someone else was nearby, a family gathering, church, the Buggy on the way to worship. Afterward, I understood that the expectation traveled with us. The location did not matter. The marriage role mattered. Over the next few years, I became quieter about what I wanted. That is one consequence of repeated pressure people sometimes overlook. Eventually, the controlled person stops creating opportunities for disagreement. You anticipate. You comply early. You arrange your life to avoid the moment when a direct demand appears. From the outside, this can look like harmony. Inside, it may be exhaustion. I want to be careful with Daniel's role in this story. He was not cruel every hour. He could be funny. He worked hard. He helped neighbors. He loved certain members of his family deeply. He was capable of tenderness. That is not a contradiction. People who control others do not have to be monsters in every part of their lives. In fact, that complexity is one reason it can take so long to understand what is happening. I believe Daniel had inherited an idea of marriage where a husband's needs carried moral weight and a wife's accommodation proved love. He did not invent that idea, but he benefited from it, and I carried its cost. Explanation is not excuse. Years after I left, I told a therapist about that Buggy ride. By then, I had told her far more dramatic things from my marriage. I almost skipped this story. It seemed too small. No bruise, no police, no screaming. Just a husband making a demand and a wife feeling she could not meaningfully refuse. My therapist stopped me. She asked, "What did you believe would happen if you simply said no?" I thought about it. Daniel might become angry. He might withdraw. He might tell me I was failing as a wife. He might speak to family. I might be told to pray more, to submit, to stop being selfish. The marriage might become colder. My standing inside the community might shift. Then she said, "That is the part that matters." I asked what she meant. She said, "Consent is not only about whether someone physically can refuse. It is about whether refusal is allowed to exist without punishment." I had never thought about it that way. I had spent years judging myself by whether I had technically possessed a choice. Technically, I could say no. But if no threatened peace, belonging, spiritual approval, affection, and sometimes basic freedom, what kind of choice was that? I did not have that language in the Buggy. I only had a feeling. A tight chest, a desire to move away, a wish that another Buggy would catch up, a prayer that church would arrive faster. My body knew before my vocabulary did. That is something I wish more women were taught. Your body's resistance is information. Fear is information. Stillness is information. Wanting distance is information. None of those feelings automatically make another person evil. But they do mean something inside you deserves attention. If you grew up somewhere very different from the Amish and still recognize this, I want you to hear me. Maybe your husband never used the word submission. Maybe it was duty, respect culture, tradition. A wife's responsibility. A husband's rights. Keeping him happy. Keeping the family together. Maybe you technically had a choice, but every version of no came with consequences you had been trained to fear. I see you. If you agreed because disagreement meant days of silence, I see you. If you complied because refusing would bring religious guilt, I see you. If you smiled in public minutes after something happened privately, I see you. If everyone thought you had a peaceful marriage because you had learned how not to create visible conflict, I see you. You were not weak. You were navigating the world available to you. I think of Ruth sometimes. The bread knife, the table, her eyes finally meeting mine. The difference between keeping peace and surrendering yourself. She never told me to leave Daniel. Maybe she was afraid to. Maybe she did not believe leaving was possible. Maybe she was speaking from her own marriage. I never asked. But she gave me one sentence that created a crack in the framework. Sometimes that is how freedom begins. Not with an escape, with a contradiction. One person tells you something that does not fit the system you were given, and because it does not fit, you keep turning it over in your mind. What if peace does not require my disappearance? What if being a wife does not make every demand righteous? What if my discomfort is not rebellion? What if no can still belong to a married woman? Those questions took years to become answers. Today, when I remember that Buggy, I do not mostly remember Daniel. I remember the road, the church only minutes away, the other families behind us, the Bible sitting beside me, all those symbols of faith and community surrounding a young woman who did not know whether she was allowed to refuse. That is the invisible part. Control does not always remove you from society. Sometimes it sits beside you while you travel directly toward it. Sometimes it happens 10 minutes before church. Sometimes you arrive, straighten your dress, greet your neighbors, and nobody knows. And sometimes years later, you finally understand that the problem was not that you failed to keep peace. The problem was that peace had been defined as your compliance. I define it differently now. Peace is not silence, marriage is not ownership, duty is not consent, and a wedding vow does not erase the right to have boundaries. Your body does not become community property when you marry. Your discomfort deserves language. Your refusal deserves space. Your voice does not stop at the buggy door. It belongs to you on the road. It belongs to you in church. It belongs to you inside marriage. And it still belongs to you after you finally learn to use it.